Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Forough Farrokzhad's book, Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season. Now, this is translated by Elizabeth T. Gray Jr., and that's worth noting, partially because there was a book published by Farrokhzad called Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, but this is not that book per se. This is a collection of Farrokhzad's poetry from various books that she published over the course of her life. The posthumous book, actually entitled Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, is included in its entirety, but there's also excerpts from her book, her first book, Captive, in 1995, her book, Wall, her book, Rebellion, that's 56 and 58, her book, Another Birth, from 1964, and then Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season from 1974. So this particular edition is not the version of Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season that Farrokhzad would have known. This is a collection. It's an edited anthology of her poetry, which is really, really cool because it gives you a good sense of her work across her career. So, Farrokhzad herself was a really, really interesting poet. She was Iranian. Her career, as I said, was largely in the 50s and into the early 60s. She was unfortunately killed quite young in a car wreck, but she was a very awesome person. We tend today, I think, especially in the US or in the West, to think of Iran as this very, rigid, hierarchical, very defined society in which particularly women's roles are highly regimented. That wasn't necessarily the case of Iranian society in the late 40s and 50s, and Farrokhzad comes out of that tradition. She comes out of an Iran that is comparatively quite liberal and quite open in terms of women's roles. And so her poetry reflects that. It reflects her difficulties in her marriage. She was married, I think, quite young, and it wasn't a super, super happy marriage. They basically separated. She had a number of lovers. She was involved in the Iranian film scene. She was involved in, obviously, poetry. She was involved in journalism. She had traveled extensively to, I think, Paris was one of the big places she spent a good amount of time and sort of absorbed some of that poetic style from the Parisian art scene. She was this very modern cosmopolitan person, and that is reflected in what she does with her poetry, particularly her early career. A lot of it rewrites this tradition of Persian love poetry. So Persian love poetry, very, very, very long history of this, going back centuries. This sort of tradition of writing about sex, writing about desire, writing about the beloved, etc., in these ways that are often tied up with nature imagery and that often depict the experience of love or the pursuit of love as a kind of spiritual matter. And most of this poetry is written by men, as is most poetry in world history, particularly prior to, say, the mid-19th century, the mid-19th century, 20th century. Farrokhzad takes this established tradition of love poetry written from the perspective of men with these sort of nature images, animal images, etc., and this idea of the pursuit of love as an almost spiritual fulfillment, and she approaches it from a different angle. She approaches it from the perspective of a female poet persona working through issues of female desire as opposed to a male perspective, a male poet persona working through issues of male desire. So there's only one poem in here from her first book. It's entitled Captive, and it, I think, sets up this tone. So this is Captive. I want you, and I know that never will I hold you as my heart desires. You are that clear, bright sky. I am a captive bird in the corner of this cage. From behind the cold, dark bars, my longing look is astonished at your face. I think that a hand might appear and suddenly free me to fly to you. I think that in a moment of carelessness, I might join from this silent prison. I might laugh in the face of the jailer. I might begin to live again at your side. I am thinking, and I know that never will I have the resolve to leave this cage, even if it were the jailer's wish. I have no strength left for flight. From beyond the bars each bright morning, a child's gaze smiles in my face. When I begin a joyous song, his lips come to me with a kiss. O sky, if I wish one day to fly from this silent prison, what will I say to the eyes of the crying child? Leave me be, I am a captive bird. I am the candle whose burning heart lights up a ruin. If I choose silence, I will shred a nest. So again, we've got that nature imagery, this extended metaphor of being a caged bird, but this is also Farrokhzad working through the sort of struggles she has with leaving her marriage. She again, was married, I think, quite young, and they did have children, and it was very unusual in Iran in the 50s for a married couple to separate. And I think Farrokhzad did probably struggle with leaving her children more so necessarily than with leaving her husband. But this idea of like finding freedom in love is paired with that nature imagery. And again, this is a very, very classic technique of Persian love poetry that Farrokhzad is putting into a different context here, because it is written, again, from the perspective of a woman leaving her husband, leaving her family to pursue a love affair. And that's a much different perspective than the traditional male perspective of I, the man, am pursuing a female lover kind of approach. We see this as well in a poem like Sin, which is actually even less conflicted. It's more sort of joyously embracing of the freedom found in love. So this is Sin. I sinned a sin full of pleasure, in an embrace that was warm and fiery. I sinned in arms that were hot and vindictive and made of iron. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I looked into his eyes full of secrets. My restless heart trembled in my chest at the demands of his hungry eyes. In that dark and silent sanctuary, I sat agitated at his side. His lips poured violent desire across my lips. I was freed from my mad heart's grief. I whispered words of love into his ear. I want you, O my love. I want you, O life-giving embrace. You, O my mad lover. The passion in his eyes lit a flame. Red wine danced in the cup, in the soft bed of my euphoric body, trembled on his chest. I sinned a sin full of pleasure, beside a dazed and trembling body. O Lord, what do I know about what I did in that dark and silent sanctuary? So again, these questions of what it means to be a lover, what it means to be in love, what it means to have sex, all of these things are traditional components of Persian poetry being approached from the opposite perspective. So that's really characteristic of Farrokhzad's early career. Her earlier books from the 50s really are dealing with love poetry and these sort of interpersonal issues. As we get to some of her later poetry, in her books Another Birth from 1964, and then Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, published after her death in 1974. These still have that element of interpersonal relationships and romance and sexuality and stuff, but they also move much more toward political commentary and an engagement with the public life of Iran. So the next two I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to read to you because they're fairly long, but I want to talk about them, and I'll read portions of them maybe. So we have the poem O Jeweled Land, which came out of her 1964 collection, which Another Birth. This is a really, really interesting one because it is a political satire about basically registering for a government identity card. And she talks about this being the sort of symbol of her birth into the political life of the nation, but it's so much overblown that, I mean, it's clearly an ironic send-up of this. It's clearly a mockery of what the government ID card means. So I want to read you just the first stanza of O Jeweled Land because you'll start to get a sense of the irony of this. Victory. I registered myself. I adorned myself with a name on an ID card. My existence distinguished with a number. So hail to number 678, issued at Precinct 5, resident of Tehran. Now I don't have to worry anymore. The kind bosom of the motherland, the pacifier of the past, full of the glory of history, the lullaby of civilization and culture, the squeaky toy of the law. Now I don't have to worry anymore. And it sort of goes on like this, with the number 678 showing up over and over and over again in these sort of increasingly ridiculous scenarios. But again, it's this sort of mockery of the governmental process of registering as a citizen, to be counted as a citizen. And so it's a really fascinating poem because of how vicious the satire is of what the government was trying to do, which is actually a fairly standard thing nowadays for governments to do. I mean, I have government ID cards from the US, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got that element. Then the last one I want to talk about, just fairly briefly, is Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, the title poem of her posthumously published final collection and also of this book. This is a lengthy poem, but what really, really strikes me is there's a lot of thematic and stylistic resonances with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Now, I'm sure Farrokhzad had read The Wasteland, possibly in translation, I don't know. I'm sure she was familiar with it. Whether or not that was sort of overtly a source text she was drawing on to shape this, I have no idea. But as I read through it, this sort of pastiche technique of pulling together different elements from various cultural backgrounds is shared between the beginning of the cold season and The Wasteland. This very philosophical tone, this sort of personal interrogation of what it means to be in a culture or in a world culture, these kinds of things, these religious echoes, etc., as well as sort of references to other pieces of literature. It's a really interesting poem. I would love to see a systematic comparison by somebody who is better qualified than me between the poem Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season and The Wasteland. I'd love to see it because I think it would be really, really fascinating to see the connections and the differences.